So I want to just welcome everybody on behalf of Colorado Business Roundtable. I'm the president, Debbie Brown, and it's great to have all of you actually in person today without masks on, here to talk about something that's so important to Colorado's economy, which is the energy sector. So we're going to be welcoming in a few minutes a fantastic panel of leaders that are here in Colorado, producing energy and making it so we can drive to the golf course, which some of us do nowadays, have hot showers, enjoy the quality of life that we do. And it'll be a really robust conversation. And in particular, I want to thank American Petroleum Institute for co-hosting today, and their fearless leader from DC is in town, Mike Sommers, who you'll hear a bit from in a few minutes. Great to welcome him back as we've become good partners, I hope, to the energy industry on behalf of Colorado Business Roundtable. So welcome once again, Mike. A little bit about Colorado Business Roundtable, if you're not familiar. We unapologetically tell the story that business is a force for good. We know that big business, we primarily represent a lot of larger employers, but we're in an ecosystem of large employers, small employers that help provide the income and the quality of life that Coloradans need to live their lives, and we're really proud about that. We're an affiliate of the National Business Roundtable, based in Washington, DC, that works on policies that not only affect employers in their states, but federal policies as well and international policies. And we feel like our work has become even more important because of COVID and what's been going on, not only with the global pandemic, but also the economic destruction and parallel issues that have happened with the business community in particular. So looking ahead, one of the things that we've worked on is a Road to Recovery initiative. I put a few copies out at your table that we brought together about 70 contributors last summer and fall in the middle of the pandemic to really have the private sector lean in more on issues that were affecting Coloradans. And we brought together what we call the ABCG, academia, business, community, and government, to come up with policies that would affect Colorado's ability to come out of the recovery stronger than ever and put us on a solid footing. We'll be doing some additional work on kind of a Road to Recovery 2.0 if anybody wants to be involved in that critical work. I want to thank, I have a couple board members in attendance today. I want to highlight and thank Danny Moore. Thanks for being here. Karina Martin. I saw Gail Denninger. Can't see where Gail went. Thank you, Gail. Peter Moore and Chris Schmidt, who you'll hear from in a minute. Did I miss any other board members from the roundtable? Okay. Thank you. These are executives from some of the state's largest employers who are leaning in even more on the kind of work that we do to tell the story that business is a force for good. So that brings me to a little bit about this topic in particular. Many of you might know I spent many years working in the energy sector. I call the energy sector folks my people. I feel very strongly about energy as being one of the most critical industries, in particular for Colorado, in terms of economic and national security. And I am honored to be a friend of the energy industry and excited about this conversation today. So with that, before we turn it over to Lynn and Mike for remarks from API, I want to introduce Chris Schmidt, who is part of my board. He's also the managing partner for the Denver Deloitte office. And as managing partner, Chris is responsible for driving client and business growth and further enhancing Deloitte's strategic positioning in the Denver market. Over his 20-year career with Deloitte, he has seen the Colorado practice grow from 200 professionals to more than 1,500 over 4 offices. So help me welcome Chris Schmidt.
Thanks. It's not often you get to come speak and your predecessor's actually here, Sandy. When I first took over 3 years ago, I used to call myself, they'd say, so what do you do at Deloitte? And I was like, I'm the new Sandy, so get used to it. It's good to see you, Sandy. So first, I'd like to say thanks to Chris and the Liberty team for hosting us here today. Liberty's been a client of ours for a number of years, and we've developed some good relationships with Chris and a number of people on his team, so it's good to be here. As the Cobert board representative and somebody who's worked in the oil and gas industry for 20 years, it's an honor to just share a couple things with you. A little bit about Cobert, a little different than what Debbie shared, just kind of numbers-wise. So Cobert partners in the state of Colorado represent about 80,000 employees, Colorado employees. Globally, our Colorado Cobert partners have about 1.7 million employees worldwide. From a revenue standpoint, the Cobert partners here account for about 12.1 billion in revenue in the state of Colorado, so pretty significant, and about 867 billion globally. So some big companies and some great representation. In terms of what we've been able to accomplish, so despite the pandemic, 2020 was a great year for us. We were able to do lots of things that helped advance our purpose of Covert. We were able to hold our 3 signature events: State of the State, View from the Top, and State of Higher Education, which are very noteworthy things here in Colorado. We did 15 virtual policy roundtables, which was a significant number. We had 12 interactive bipartisan, I kind of chuckle when I say bipartisan now, they were bipartisan for the most part, briefings with Colorado's top elected officials. We did 40 profit with purpose podcasts. That's a tough one to say. There's a lot of P's in there. And then we launched 4 new initiatives. So Debbie talked a little bit about Road to Recovery. We also launched a very kind of pro-business marketing campaign, which is called Faces of Business. We're doing some great work around workforce and immigration. And then we're launching a business-bound program to kind of help with people that are starting businesses and give them some of the kind of hard, tangible skills that they would need to grow their businesses and expand them. So, looking ahead, Debbie talked about, our mantra is tell the story of business unapologetically, and that's what we're going to continue doing. That's why I'm involved. I think we all believe on our board that business is a force that when we do good, everybody in Colorado does good, and we're going to keep doing that despite what happens, other places around the state. So with that, Debbie, I'll turn it back to you, and thanks again for having us today, Lynn.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Before I introduce Lynn, I was going to tell the story, Mike, of the face mask which is maybe our little private joke, but I think it's fun. The last time I saw Mike was at a panel with the U.S. Energy Secretary, and it was during COVID, and everybody was required to wear masks. So unlike today, where we can just enjoy actually, having a Coke after a meeting. And I decided I didn't want to go to meet the Energy Secretary with just a plain mask. That seemed so, early pandemic when you had plain masks. And I was fortunate enough to have a mom who has an embroidery machine. So I thought, I should really show up and, have a snazzy mask. And I couldn't find any material with, energy themes, but I had her do a oil derrick on the side of my mask. Well, because she's such a perfectionist, she did several because she wanted to make sure it was just right. So I gave Mike one of my oil derrick masks. So yeah, we thought that was kind of nerdy, but fun. So anyway, I'm excited now to introduce Lynn, who's going to introduce Mike, and then the panelists will come up. I've had the real pleasure of working with Lynn in several capacities, but also as her current role as the Executive Director of API Colorado. And she's a very gifted leader in our state. We're lucky to have her here. She runs API Colorado, a statewide organization focusing on energy priorities in the state, including hydraulic fracturing and energy infrastructure. Lynn leads API's efforts in the state, helping the natural gas and oil industry create jobs, generate more revenue for the state, and make America less reliant on foreign energy. And I also want to say Lynn is a new board member for Covert. So take it away, Lynn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Debbie, so much. We really enjoyed the partnership with Colorado Business Roundtable, and good afternoon. It's so great. I know this might get old too, but so great to be in person and see everyone here. It's really, really lovely, and we've got beautiful weather as well. As Debbie mentioned, my name is Lynn Granger. I'm the Executive Director for the American Petroleum Institute's Colorado office. We are a division of API representing all segments of the natural gas and oil industry here in the state. It's my pleasure to address you today. It's a conversation we'll soon take in as timely as it is important. I'm grateful again to our co-hosts at Colorado Business Roundtable and to Liberty Oilfield Services for providing such a wonderful venue for today's event. Since the turn of the year, the Colorado Business Roundtable has hosted a number of events as part of its Road to Recovery series. And we are naturally pleased with the assessment that the energy industry will be crucial to the state's return to economic vibrancy. Across sectors, almost none were immune from the economic hardships of COVID, and the energy industry in particular faced its most challenging year on record. In Colorado alone, thousands of direct employees of the natural gas and oil industry filed initial unemployment claims from the beginning of the pandemic through the end of last year. Operators of every size faced extraordinary challenges and historically low energy demand, and a Saudi-Russia price war sent prices plummeting. For its part, Colorado had derived about $112 million from oil and gas severance taxes in fiscal year 1920, with a forecasted decline of 95.7% to just $4.9 million in fiscal year 2021. That brings us to today's conversation, the role of Colorado's energy industry in getting the state back on its feet. I know I'm not alone in this room in submitting that as goes Colorado's energy sector, so goes our economy. By our very nature, Coloradans are active and on the move. And as our society reopens in the wake of the past 15 months, we are already seeing demand hurdle toward pre-pandemic levels. Both here at home and across the world, having access to affordable, reliable energy remains paramount, and we're here to help provide exactly that for Colorado and for the world. As API's president and CEO often says, our energy future is absolutely an all of the above solution, but it can't be a none of the below. With that, it is my honor to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Mike Sommers. Mike is the 15th Chief Executive of the American Petroleum Institute. Since his appointment in July 2018, Mike has overseen the strategic realignment of API's priorities and advocacy efforts, introducing an integrated organizational structure and core API principles. Among other initiatives, he has led the adoption of the industry's solutions-oriented position on climate change, the development of an industry-wide narrative to broaden the sector's base of support, and the increased utilization and visibility of API standard and safety programs. Before taking the helm at API, Mike held critical leadership roles in the U.S. House of Representatives and at the White House, including as Chief of Staff for Speaker of the House John Boehner and Special Assistant to President George W. Bush at the National Economic Council. Mike is a native of Naperville, Illinois, and a graduate of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Please join me in giving Mike a very warm Colorado welcome.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and it's so great to be back in Colorado. Lynn mentioned that I'm actually about to celebrate my 3rd anniversary with the American Petroleum Institute as our president and CEO, but what she didn't tell you was that the moment that I got this job, the first visit that I made was to the great state of Colorado. And let me tell you why. I came to Colorado because really what happens in Colorado has a tendency to spread to the rest of the country, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. And I recognized when I got to Colorado the importance of our continued engagement in this state. As Lynn said, you remain one of the top 5 producers of energy in the United States. And you deal with a completely different regulatory environment than we see in other top production states, particularly in the state of Texas, for example. But we knew from the very beginning about the importance of engaging in Colorado and keeping our key office in Colorado to make sure that we could continue to influence the regulatory and the legislative process in this state. Because as I said, what happens in Colorado has this tendency to go to other neighbors around here. And we knew that we were going to have a number of members that are going to continue to have a big influence and have a big presence in this state. And it was important for us to be able to continue to influence at the legislative level, and of course now in particular at the regulatory level. Lynn does a great job in leading our Colorado office here. We and API member companies are committed to Colorado. The resources here are unrivaled by any other area in our country. And we want to make sure that we can continue to produce here in a safe and responsible way. Let me just throw out a couple of numbers that puts that into perspective. So before we dealt with this terrible pandemic that we've been dealing with over the course of the last 15 months, the world was consuming about 100 million barrels of oil every single day. Every single day, the world consumes 100 million barrels of oil. During the worst part of the pandemic, in April of last year, the world was still consuming 81 million barrels of oil every single day. Think about that for a minute. We had basically shut down the world economy, and the world was still consuming over 80 million barrels of oil every single day. Based on API numbers, we're back up very close to that 100 million barrel of oil use every single day, and demand is continuing to rise. In fact, we predict that by the end of 2022, that the world will be consuming about 102 million barrels of oil every day. The question that I think policymakers have to ask, and we ask this question both in Colorado and in the United States Congress, is where is that oil going to come from? Is it going to come from producers that adhere to the strictest environmental standards and that are in compliance with those standards and that are providing that energy here at home? Or are we going to get it from somewhere else? Unfortunately, some of the policies that we've seen so far, not just in the state of Colorado, but throughout the country, have been what we call an import more oil policy. Because the world's going to continue to demand these products, the United States is going to continue to demand these products. Where are those products going to come from? We want them to come from the United States. Why is that important? First of all, it's important from a national security perspective. We do not want to be held hostage to regimes that are hostile to American interests. So it's important that we continue to be a world-class provider of energy to the world. I have the great advantage in this job that I get to travel all over the country to talk about the benefits of our energy system. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Louisiana, where I got to see a liquefied natural gas producer in the state, Schmidt, who was shipping all over the world U.S. LNG. As you know, one of the reasons why we have been the world leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions is because of our switch from coal to natural gas as the #1 provider of power in the United States. We want to make sure that we're able to export that environmental progress all over the world. It's good for American producers, and it's good for our environment. But we also recognize that it's not enough for us to talk about only what our industry is doing. We also have to step up to the plate and provide answers to federal and local policymakers about what the government should be doing to ensure that we're the best stewards of our environment. So in response to that, API recently put out our Climate Action Framework, which you can find at our website at api.org/climate. And what this is it's a 5-point plan that addresses those needs that policymakers need to address and the environment that they should develop to address climate change. But at the same time, 3 of those principles are about what the industry is going to do to improve our own performance. It's not enough to say that climate change is real and that man is contributing to a changing climate. We must have answers in the public policy realm. And that's why we've taken this forward-leaning approach at the American Petroleum Institute. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that api.org/climate to see what we want to put forward. No matter what, we know that Congress is going to continue to be divided. The political parties are further apart on these issues than they have ever been. So it's important that we not just challenge lawmakers to do what needs to be done, but the industry also needs to step up to the plate and do what it needs to do to ensure that we're advancing our national security and the importance of reliability for American consumers, which I believe is going to continue to be a major topic within the public policy realm. I think every energy system has to answer really 3 questions. How are you going to provide reliable energy? How are you going to provide affordable energy? And how are you going to make it and produce it in a cleaner way? And at API, and within our member companies, we're focused on answering those 3 questions. So I'm excited today to welcome our panel. So I might ask the panel to please come up. I get to moderate a discussion with an incredible group of individuals. I'll let them take their seats. So our first panelist, to my the farthest left here, is known to many of you, Ron Dusick, President of Liberty Oilfield Services. I think all of us owe Ron a great round of applause for hosting us today at your beautiful headquarters. So Ron, welcome. Thank you. We also have Alice Jackson, President of Xcel Energy Colorado. I'm excited to announce that we are new friends because I mentioned in my biography, I'm a graduate of Miami University, Oxford, Ohio. My daughter begins there as a freshman in a few weeks, as does Alice's son. So we're already planning to get them together in some way. Energy advocates have to stick together.
That's right.
Danny Spletstasser, Vice President of Origination and Investor Relations at Renewable Energy Systems. Danny, welcome. And Hodge Walker. Hodge is Vice President of the Chevron Rockies Business Unit. Hodge took us on a great tour this morning of one of their incredible facilities just north of here. So Hodge, welcome. Chevron, of course, is a great member of the American Petroleum Institute. So I'm going to start with just an opening question for all panelists. How do you see the energy industry powering the economic rebound of a post-pandemic America, and more specifically, Colorado? Why don't we begin with our host, Ron? You want to kick us off?
Sure. I certainly have a few thoughts on that. I think Lynn put it well when she was talking about just how important affordable energy is to our world, and particularly in a time like this when we're looking at a rebound. We've already seen, I think, the effects of a potential lack of investment over the last little while on the price of oil. For those of you who follow WTI, that number has a 7 in front of it now. A little while since it's had one of those in front of it. But of course, high cost energy has a negative impact in all kinds of ways. We are an energy intensive country. I think the rough numbers I know off the top of my head are we use about 1.5 kilowatt hours of energy per dollar of GDP that we generate. So energy, very, very important to us. And the price of energy may be even more important than that. And so as we think about digging ourselves back out of this challenging year we've all been through, certainly I focus a lot on the price of energy and what that ultimately means. And you can think about that from a business standpoint. Obviously, the cost of that as an input to manufacturing or whatever industry you're in, but certainly from a personal standpoint, we have a large amount of the population, and maybe even more so now than the statistics that are available would show, that are challenged to pay their energy bills. And to the extent we make energy more expensive, that makes their lives more challenging and the decisions that they have to make more challenging. And so I am all about doing everything we can to find ways to provide reliable, low-cost energy to help lift industry, business, and people out of the situation we've been in. And I think probably single most important input to that.
Great. Alice, do you want to respond to that question?
Sure. So there's a lot of different perspectives we could take on this one. We talked about energy and the cost of it to customers. And I think some of the grounding that we have for the recovery has to go back to what we actually saw happen during this time frame. So being purely selfish for a little bit and talking about the electric industry perspective, when we saw the changes in the consumption patterns over the past year, we saw dramatic changes in the commercial and industrial sector. We also saw dramatic changes in the residential sector, but the two were opposite each other. We saw incredible increases in how our residential customers were using energy in their homes. And so naturally, that bill component of your monthly budget went up. But then we saw on the other side of the equation, the businesses, because people were going to their homes. There was lower manufacturing levels, particularly early on, and we've seen some of those coming back, that has significantly impacted the industry and the economy here in the state of Colorado, not to mention our own pocketbook. And so being able to figure out what is the balance that we have to strike. We are seeing significant increases in the consumer production and the consumption in our commercial sector starting now. We've seen growth in many areas in the industry in the state of Colorado. In fact, we are well exceeding the number of new customers, the expansion, whether it's homes, businesses, resorts in the mountains, beyond what we've seen in the past 5 years in the state of Colorado. So growth is coming. It's coming our direction. We have customers that are demanding our energy products, whether they're electricity, their oil, their natural gas, in order to heat their homes, do their jobs, and move things forward. But we also have to find a way, how do we make sure that those jobs are available for the employees and the residents for the state of Colorado long term? What is this going to look like? It's not just a hit the bump and move things on and then it comes back down. We need to figure out what is that long-term trajectory and where are we putting things in place that provide the resiliency of the systems that we are reinvesting in as we grow back into normalcy. Although I think normalcy is going to be a little bit different than what we saw before. So we're continuing to watch what's happening in the economy. The number of housing starts in the state of Colorado is once again up. I believe we're the
fastest expanding economy in the country as of 2020, whereas previous years we've been the first. So we're still really high up there on the list. But one of the factors that I come back to look at is J.D. Power sentiment. When we just recently completed our first quarter sentiment evaluation, the feedback we got was that the residents of the state of Colorado not only think that they are worse off than others, they think they are the worst off than the rest of the United States, which is an interesting perspective for them to put on things. But that's also driven by whether it's media, it's whether personal experience or other things that are going on. But it's fascinating when you look at the economics and the numbers on the books versus the public sentiment, the divergence that we're currently seeing in the state of Colorado. And that's another question that I think that we have to address just as much as the economic infrastructure that we're investing in. It's really partly around that public sentiment as well.
Danny.
It's very interesting when you came to the, what's important in an energy system for it to be reliable, affordable, and eventually getting towards sustainable, and taking on the, being a person on the energy transition side. It's really important that, we're just starting this transition. And for many of us, the move in the energy sector from purely or largely being extraction and production towards more electrification is something that we here at RES are really striving and driving on. And to answer your question, I think that Colorado is well positioned in that it has abundance of energy of all sorts here in the state. And in driving on bringing to that more sustainable future, we have the ability to power all, the majority or a large portion of our electric generation from natural gas and renewables, increasingly so renewables. And so how I think Colorado is going to continue to drive the American recovery when it uses energies, it's going to be a turn towards the future while leveraging the strengths of what we currently have. And so I think when it comes to using both the environment that we have in terms of an abundance of oil and gas resources, wind and solar, as well as a growing economy, I think that we're well positioned to be able to really set an even stronger foot as being an energy hub for the nation. And your point on where Colorado goes, the nation sort of goes, I see that happening in spades as part of the energy transition.
That's great. Hodge?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. You touched on a couple interesting points early on and mentioned some facts, and those facts really point out, speaking to the oil and natural gas industry, how essential it is to our world. Here we were in the midst of the largest economic slowdown that we had seen in decades, and yet the world was still utilizing 90% of the oil and natural gas it was utilizing pre-pandemic. That just kind of further gives evidence to how much ingrained the oil and gas industry is into this world economy. That said, we need to be thinking about the future, and the future being cleaner energy. If you look at this industry and what this industry has done over time, the shale revolution, which really catapulted the economic growth of this nation over the last several years, really positioned this country in a different place and positioned it in a positive way from a trade perspective, brought in tremendous investment, and really allowed us to create more jobs. And these jobs are being able to deliver that energy that this world needs. So if you take it one step lower in thinking about the tiers of this recovery, you think about our industry, the oil and natural gas industry. One of the things that we need to do is think about how do we produce cleaner energy? And how do we do that in a way that delivers the returns that our investors are looking for? And how do we make sure we do that in a capitally efficient way, even in the face of some rising oil prices? But we need to be able to do that and deliver the returns and do that very capitally efficiently, and not chase returns, but look at the balance of supply and demand and make sure that that energy is out there. If you look at it from Chevron's perspective, from an investment perspective, we're going to be investing about the same that we did last year. But we're going to make sure that we're positioned and making sure that we're looking at that longer term supply and demand balance and positioning ourselves to move if we need to address that balance, to make sure that energy prices are being managed in the appropriate way. addressed in the appropriate way.
So I want to pivot this conversation a little bit to what's going to be required to build out this, continue to build out this energy system. And particularly, I want to talk about energy infrastructure. You know, there are going to be different perspectives here, I think, on this panel. And this wouldn't be a panel that was interesting to listen to if there wasn't a little bit of controversy. So I think you'll all have different perspectives on this. But I want to start with Ron, and you know, in particular, I want to hear what your thoughts on expanding the existing pipeline system and other critical energy infrastructure that is going to be so important to building out America's continued economic recovery and our future success.
My guess is we're not going to be as disagreed on this as you might think. You know, I think that in our world specifically it's pipelines, of course, but whether you're talking about pipelines or transmission infrastructure or whatever the case might be, all equally important to our long-term success. And you know, specifically for us, of course, the pipeline situation is a frustrating one. I think you've heard a couple of times already that I think we all believe that demand for oil and gas will be very, very strong for, I would argue, decades to come yet. I don't think there's any pathway that sees us significantly change our consumption of oil and natural gas for many, many years to come. And as a result, infrastructure to transport that around not only North America, but ultimately around the globe is incredibly important. And unfortunately, I think when we don't make the right decisions from an infrastructure investment standpoint, that ultimately leads to poor things happening. And you know, we don't change the demand for oil by virtue of not building a pipeline. All we do is change how that oil gets moved. And so typically the replacement today for a pipeline is going to be the railroad. And so that doesn't prevent us from moving that product. I would argue it probably makes us move that product in a more expensive fashion. And I would certainly argue a much, much less safe fashion and probably less environmentally responsible fashion. And so if we think about these two parallel goals of A, continuing to provide the world with the energy that it needs, and North America with the energy that it needs, and to do so in the most environmentally responsible fashion, it frustrates me to see that we are not continuing to build out infrastructure to allow that to happen. And so I don't know how we change that narrative, but from my standpoint, that infrastructure is incredibly important. We will continue to maybe not grow at the level we had in the past. We certainly had a situation in the oil and gas industry where we maybe got out a little over the tips of our skis, and we saw production grow dramatically over a period of time. That had huge economic benefits for the world. I think measured in maybe something north of $1 trillion a year, $200 for every man, woman, and child on the face of this earth in reduced energy costs as a result of that. I don't know that we go back to those heady days of growth, but there's no reason we don't remain at least stable at something north of 11 million barrels a day of production. And I think given the given the environment we are in today, and the fact that I would argue we are the most responsible producers of that commodity on the earth, there's no reason we don't return to a period of growth. And I suspect we see production continue to climb. And as a result, we need infrastructure to move that product, oil for sure, but maybe even more so natural gas around the world. The United States is growing LPG exports, propane as we call it here, by a factor of 15 over just the last little while. I view that as incredibly important in terms of the well-being of humanity. We have a couple of billion people today who cook over solid fuel still, and that leads to terrible health outcomes. Exporting LPG and giving them an LPG stove to cook over is a dramatic life change for them. But that only happens if we have the infrastructure to export those commodities. So I think something we need to change the narrative on, that needs to continue to be a focus. We've got to figure out a way to make sure that people understand the true trade-offs when we make these decisions. And I don't think we're saying that today. I think the conversation considers one side of the teeter-totter and not the other.
Alice, maybe you can talk about this from an electricity perspective as well.
Actually, I was hoping that I could talk to it about it a little bit from the LDC perspective too. But so not only are we an electric provider in the state of Colorado, we're also a local distribution company. So we provide the natural gas to many, many homes in the state of Colorado in order to heat their homes. The resorts that you visit, the outdoor fireplaces that you enjoy, those are things that come through our pipelines. And it's really interesting because a couple of things have happened in the past several years. First off, we've had a couple of regulators that are appointed that really question whether or not that infrastructure is going to exist 10 years from now. You didn't hear me wrong. 10 years from now, they think it may be gone. And so they're questioning whether or not we should be making the investment in the natural gas pipelines that serve your homes, your businesses, up into the mountains and the other industry across the state. This is something we are readily and actively combating and providing facts around to our Public Utilities Commission. But it's not only there. Under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Roadmap in the state of Colorado, whenever they looked at the total industry-wide carbon reductions by 2030, one of the segments that they included in there were businesses and homes and companies needing to reduce their emissions from natural gas utilization by about 20%. That's not easy. That's either replacing in the pipe something with natural gas. Instead of natural gas, you're doing renewable natural gas, so think dairy farms. We don't have enough of them across the state of Colorado to meet the needs of the consumers in the state of Colorado to fit that 20% in. We had a blank book on how are we actually going to progress this forward. This past legislative session, we were successful in working with a number of areas of industry to talk about a clean heat plan. What does this look like so that we have consumer protections in place for the cost associated with moving these things forward? That has been a significant focus of ours because otherwise the continued conversation at our regulator is going to be around, should you even make safety required investments in the pipelines, which to us are a no-brainer. You have to do those because until the last customer is off the pipe, you have to maintain the safety of the entire pipe. But that doesn't also mean that we shouldn't be making investments in other areas, whether that's participating with you all and looking at upstream production and figuring out how do we continuously reduce the methane emissions from that upstream production, and projects like we have like Project Canary and the pilots that we're doing on looking at those things, or exploring electrolysis processes that produce hydrogen from the excess renewable energy that we have on the system that then blends into the pipe. But for you science geeks in the audience, you're sitting there saying, but Alice, that molecule's smaller, it embrittles the pipe, it could leak out the wells, all of those kinds of things, which we don't want to have happen, which means we can't completely replace it. You can blend it to a certain point, but we also have to continue to invest in the technology that then would take it back to the size of a methane molecule to move it safely to our customers. There are a variety of things that we are having to look at, but to the very truism that what starts in Colorado then travels elsewhere, this is what we're having to concentrate on now. I'm literally filing testimony at the Public Utilities Commission defending why we need to continue to have a local distribution company and investment in our pipelines. We are actively answering questions about why this infrastructure is going to exist 10 years from now and beyond. So those are things that we are talking about and tackling in the state of Colorado right now. What I would, last piece, because I know I need to share. November of last year, we put a survey out into the state that asked general consumers what they thought about the utilization of natural gas versus other pieces of the system. And would they be willing to trade their natural gas stoves, appliances, fire pits for an alternative, regardless of political position? 2/3 of them came back and said, not only no, but hell no. And so that is where public sentiment is. When you ask the verbatim on why, the way they answer you is they say, because it's cleaner than coal, it takes less energy intensity to heat my home with this product or to run my business. They understand the science. Does it mean that it's going to continue to increase? No. It does mean that we have to continue to look at ways to make it cleaner and cleaner. It's not going to be a boom cycle where we're going to see significant amounts of it utilized more. It is going to either be flat, in our opinion, to slightly declining in the utilization over time, whether it's on the electric side or it's on the natural gas LDC side. But these are the realities of what we're facing and we're talking about in Colorado. And I think more people need to understand and join in on the conversation because we do have a lot of science we're going to have to continue to invest in if we're going to transition and we're going to progress as a community and as a society.
Danny, I want to bring you in on this conversation because infrastructure development could be very important to the build out of renewables as well. And it has to be top of mind for you.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look, depending upon the projection through 2050, in the electric sector alone, you're looking at something like 2.4 terawatts of additional electricity generation. That's approximately $2.4 trillion of investment in the way that we generate electricity. And that can't just come solely in the generation, it has to be in how we move it. And so in our transition, what we see is that infrastructure, whether we were talking just at the top about infrastructure is infrastructure, and the challenges of placement and working with communities and social license is incredibly important. And it's critical to being able to deploy that capital and be able to work within the communities that we also create jobs and power the lives of the people who are in that community. So for us, I guess while we are in absolute agreement that in order to power our lives, reliably and cost effectively, that infrastructure is infrastructure, and we need to find the best practices that already exist in existing industries and in up and coming industries about social license. But I think we have to recognize that there's another round of additional infrastructure that will be required to facilitate the energy transition that is contemplated to put more emphasis not just on the reliable, not just on the cost effective, but also on the sustainable.
That's great. I feel like we've developed some consensus here. That's that's great. Scott, I want to bring you in on this conversation. Hodge, I want to bring you. Scott. Hodge, I want to make sure we're bringing you in on this conversation as well, in particular when it comes to renewables and the importance of natural gas in backing up renewables to make sure that we have a reliable source of energy. Can you speak, Hodge, a little bit about that factor in this as well?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about and we mentioned, we have this belief in that, the future of energy is really cleaner energy. And we believe in affordable, reliable, cleaner energy to be able to deliver the world that we need, the power that we need to generate and move our economies forward. And, if you take a look at where we stand for that energy and where we are today, if we take a look at where that energy demand comes from, House Bill or Colorado Bill 1261 comes out, and it talks about going into electrification, and there's some incentives there to increase electric vehicle use and increase electrification of buildings. And to be able to do that, the amount of electricity necessary to meet those aspirations is actually going to double the generation demand from 2040 to 2060. Over 20 years, we're nearly going to, or 2020 to 2040, sorry. So over a 20-year period, we're talking about doubling the electric demand. We believe that natural gas is a big component of that, and it is a vital component of that going forward to be able to produce reliable, scalable, and ever cleaner energy to meet that demand that's going to be growing over time.
Danny, you've talked a little bit about this energy transition, and I think all of us agree that the future is going to be all of the above. We can't sacrifice one energy system now. We're going to need more energy, as Hodge just pointed out. Can you talk a little bit about how Colorado-made energy can continue to contribute to this global conversation about the energy transition and around climate change, and in particular about how we can continue to work to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions?
Sure. I think there are two ways we can both lead by example and lead by thought. So in the lead by example, quite frankly, our friends at Xcel have been doing that and leading by example by creating a more balanced and increasingly renewable generation mix. That includes, mixing, and thank goodness for having the ability to have balance off with natural gas with more flexible resources and continuing to change the mix over time in a responsible way that doesn't leave assets stranded for ratepayers. It is something that Xcel and others in the state are doing in the generation mix. The other one is linear infrastructure intrastate and interstate, and this happens more on the transmission side. I'm sure Alice would be happy to tell you all about the need for linear infrastructure on the transmission side that Xcel thinks is needed in order to bring that additional generation from the sunniest and windiest places in the state here. And then, and so I think those two pieces go together, and that provides that sort of ability for change the way that we generate electricity and enables that electrification you're speaking of. The other one is thought leadership, and I think, thank you to Debbie for, not just pulling us together to think about how energy will fit in the broader mix and in the broadest sense. But I also want to thank you for giving me an excuse to come out and find out that my business suit still fits. So that was, thank you for that. But yeah, it's the thought leadership aspect. It's building a community and fostering a community that is energy in the broadest sense and investing in those additional entities, both on the corporate side, in the education side, and in our national laboratories, and really showing that we're not just a great energy location for the thought leadership in the extraction, production, and midstream space, but also in the electrification and renewable space. And that's really important for that long-term drive for Colorado to be a meaningful and sustained player as an energy player as we make this transition.
So Alice, let's bring you in on this conversation because he referenced you as both an electricity provider and an LDC.
No, I think so. In Colorado, we are incredibly blessed. We have the great fortune of having our 300 days of sunshine, which we like to use, whether it's economic development and attracting businesses to here. We also like to use it to generate electricity from the sun. We also have great wind speeds across the eastern plains of Colorado. So as compared to other states with these two resources, that really sets us apart. And it gives us a leg up on the other states on trying to figure out how do we solve this puzzle. Just to geek out for a minute, I'm going to say some things that are really obvious, but they're really interesting in how it kind of weaves together. Wind primarily blows at night. The sun primarily shines during the day. So really obvious, right? But they also have seasonal characteristics, which means the shoulder months in the spring and the summer, you have wind that's more prevalent. And in the summer months, just go outside for a minute, feel the intensity of the sun in the summertime versus the winter. So figuring out how to blend these things together when you're putting together an electric resource plan to meet the needs of the energy of all of our consumers, we no longer just have to look at 1 hour a year, which used to be we evaluated the peak. And we said once you built everything up to get to the peak, you could turn things off the other hours of the year and you were fine. Now we have to plan for all 8,760 hours in a year because of the variable energy resources that we are integrating into our system. In the state of Colorado, we are leading the country. Not only in the state of Colorado, at Xcel Energy, we are leading the country. We have roughly a 7,000 megawatt peak. We have over 4,000 megawatts of wind installed, and we're proposing to add another 1,300 megawatts of wind. So in the resource plan that we presented to the commission just a couple of months ago, we're going to move the system to not only delivering an 85% carbon reduction from our 2005 levels by 2030, we're also going to be delivering 80% of the kilowatt hours that every single customer utilizes on our system from a renewable energy resource. That is far beyond what any other state that has any material manufacturing included in it has been able to figure out. Not only that, when we look at the summer months, we're going to be dependent on renewable resources to meet the peak consumption on our system. But then you go, but what about the winter, Alice? In the winter months, the great thing is because where we sit today and where we think we're going to be over the next decade, we will have enough dispatchable resources, including the incredibly valuable combustion turbines that are run on natural gas in order to meet those winter storms, whether it's Winter Storm Uri, it's a bomb cyclone, or it's some other type of storm that comes in to hit our community. Because if something were to go sideways during the summertime, you get a little uncomfortable. But during the winter, there are significant life impacts that we have to consider. So when we look at planning for the system, we really do have to look at all the risks and the contingencies that we put together. To your point about the vertical and the surface level, we need transmission. The eastern plains are ripe with the wind and the solar, but the problem is we got to get it back to the city centers. Denver Metro is not in the middle of the windiest areas. Denver Metro is not in the middle of the sunniest areas. So we have to be able to move that energy around our state in order to get it back to where people live, work, play, and the jobs are located. Which means we also have to look at a robust transmission network because right now what we see with the 4,000 megawatts of wind is we have largely radial lines. Meaning like when that line gets to cut or something happens to it, Mylar balloon or the hawk that hit the transformer yesterday where we had an outage, those things you need to have a different path for those electrons to get back to the customers. So that's why we are before the commission right now with roughly $8 billion worth of infrastructure investment between wind, solar, 1,400 megawatts of natural gas CTs that we're looking at, plus the transmission infrastructure that's necessary not only to solve Xcel Energy's issues with delivering roughly 6,000 megawatts back to city centers, but also the other utility issues in the state. That's infrastructure that we're looking at. That's investment in the state of Colorado. That's truly helping bring us back from any pandemic economic impacts because those investments need to happen now. And so we're going through the process. It is a 2-year process to go through these things. But we're going through the process at the Public Utilities Commission that's going to deliver on these things for customers. And the punchline is we think we can do this for less than the rate of inflation as far as bill impacts on our customers through 2030. That's the real way of figuring out how do you bring these things together. We do know, however, there's a heck of a lot of work to do to get beyond 2030 and that 85% carbon reduction, and that's going to take a lot of technological investment and innovation.
Great, thank you, Alice. So I want to bring Ron in on this conversation because I do think we've talked a lot about building out infrastructure, what the energy transition looks like, but I also want to talk about the regulatory environment. So we're of course dealing with this at the federal level, but it's an important component of the Colorado energy mix as well. So could you talk about some of the regulatory improvements really at the nexus of the energy industry and the broader business community that would be beneficial to customers, investors, and other stakeholders?
Sure. I maybe want to touch on this last topic a little bit because I think it delves into this next topic. And so, we are incredibly blessed in Colorado. It is a wonderful environment, and to Alice's point, of course, that puts us in a position that no other state and maybe no other country could possibly lay claim to in terms of our opportunity here. My fear is, of course, and this plays into the regulatory environment that happens here, that the conversation becomes very myopic in focus then, that there's an expectation that because we can achieve these results in Colorado, that's a result that should be expected around the globe. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. I turned 50 years old in 2 weeks' time. The day I was born, oil and gas, hydrocarbons, including coal, provided 80% of primary energy on the globe. Today, 50 years later, that number is still true as a percentage. And I expect that remains meaningfully true for the long term. And so I'm concerned that the conversation that happens in Colorado is sometimes driven by what we see happening locally here, which I don't think is reflective of what is going to happen around the globe for the foreseeable future. And so from a regulatory standpoint, what that has meant, particularly for oil and gas for sure, and maybe for others, is an environment that's been somewhat unstable, that has been moving very, very rapidly, and it has made it, and Hodge can probably speak in more detail to this than even I can, where we feel the secondary effects of this, a difficult place to focus investment because there is some unsurety around what the next year will hold. And we've seen that in, I might call it democracy run amok a little bit in the ballot process here. I'm a transplant from Canada. I've never seen such a thing that allows you to change the Constitution so frequently. So that was a bit of a new thing to me. But we're feeling it in the regulatory environment now. And while I think we all strongly believe in the oil and gas industry, we want to be at the leading edge, and I would argue we have been and will continue to be in Colorado. Every next generation technology that Liberty has deployed and continues to deploy gets deployed here in Colorado first, ensuring that we are absolutely at the tip of the spear, at the front of the line in terms of producing the cleanest possible molecule we can. That's incumbent upon us as a responsibility, or as a responsible industry. But I think if you're on the investment side of the situation, and whether you're a shareholder or a private equity firm or whatever, looking at an environment that's been moving as rapidly as Colorado has, with no surety around when that is going to stop changing, makes it difficult to do business here. And so I think we always want to find the absolute best technology to deploy to the field that is within the practical limits of reality today. But there has to be some stability to that to allow businesses to start to plan for the future. And I think we've struggled with that a little bit in Colorado here of late. And so I hope that we've worked through a number of these rulemakings. There's still a little bit more work to go. But I hope that we can get to a place where people can look and say, we have done a great job setting Colorado up for success. We believe we have a regulatory framework in place that holds us to the highest standards and to account for meeting those standards, and that then we can go forward and do business after that.
Hodge, do you want to address that from an upstream perspective as well?
You touched on a couple points that are coming forward here. If you think about the regulatory environment, what we need is to really be able to sit down and have a conversation about what are the problems we're trying to solve, and what are the rules and regulations that we need to put into place that allows for that. Have some predictability in rules so that we have predictability in how our investments are going to move forward to be able to deliver the power that we need as a society. if you think about it from a jobs perspective, API did a study with PricewaterhouseCoopers a few years ago. And if you look at the impact of jobs on changing regulations and further pressure on this oil and gas industry, at that time, Colorado ranked number 10 as far as jobs in the oil and gas industry. But if you look at the impact on revenue generation to labor or to the state, it ranked on number 4. So that pass-through of jobs to value to the state was significant. From a jobs perspective, about 78,000 jobs at the time of that study were attributed directly to the oil and natural gas industry. About 26,000 were indirect in those roles. One of the things that we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about are those induced jobs. Those jobs that are a result of a capitally intensive industry like our industry. From what our employees, both direct and the indirect individuals within our industry spend. And these are the barbers, the dentists, all these roles and jobs that are out there as a result of our industry working here. So if you take a step back and think about rules and regulations and how they may slow down the oil and gas industry in the state or actually remove the oil and gas industry in the state, it doesn't only impact those 78,000 employees or the 26,000 indirect. It also impacts that other 129,000, those dentists, those barbers that I mentioned. So these rules have big impact, and they're beyond just the oil and gas industry. They really impact the entire value chain and supply chain of the state.
Alice, I want to bring you in on this conversation as well, but in your answer, I'd also like you to address, it does seem like there is a collaborative spirit here in the state of Colorado, where in a lot of the other places where I visit, it's us versus them. So could you talk a little bit about, one, the regulatory environment and how you found that collaborative spirit on your end in the state of Colorado?
Absolutely. So I had the pleasure of joining the Colorado team roughly 8 years ago. And when I came in, I was coming from Amarillo, Texas. I've been with Excel for about a decade now. And what I inherited was not just a regulatory environment where my responsibility was to go in and say, okay, here's a revenue increase that we need to ask for. But also I was handed something called the solar wars at that point in time, which was a significant divide perception-wise between us and the solar industry on rooftop installations, the cost to our customers, and those pieces of the puzzle. It had created a huge rift in conversations between our organization, the environmental organizations, and quite frankly, the regulators were somewhat stuck in the middle. So that was something that we had to work our way through. And in 2016, we started significantly investing our time in working through that process. And it took literally an entire summer where we sat down and we were litigating 3 major cases at our regulatory commission that were incredibly contentious. We had 26 different parties, 65 different interveners individually in the room whenever we were sitting down to have these dialogues. And we successfully negotiated settlements across all 3 of those cases with pluses and minuses for everybody. And what it really came down to doing was understanding truly what the other side was looking for. So to your comment about we need to have a better conversation with our regulators about what is it that we're trying to accomplish, getting to that and just sitting down sometimes and asking the question, why? Why is that important to you? How does that impact you as a business? Because what was happening is that they had goals that they wanted to achieve and they had a direction that they had seen, they were making that proposal. And the problem was yes, they were going to get to their outcome, but in doing so, they were hurting us, or they were hurting the system, or they were hurting our other customers. But by sitting down and going, okay, what is your outcome? And then going back and going, do you really care the pathway that you take to get there as long as you get that outcome? And the answer was no. Then we could craft together then a pathway and a direction that we could go in order to get to success for both sides. And that's ultimately what we spent the entire summer of 2016 doing. Establishing those relationships has paid dividends year after year, because those relationships, then you can sit back down and you can go back to them and say, this is what's going on. And it's a matter of them understanding that you're coming to the table with positive intent. I know you may see that as a buzzword or hokey, but it's having them be able to give you the benefit of the doubt so that you can have the dialogue. And that's really what has been the best outcome of engaging and figuring out that process. We won't always agree, and we don't. We fight all the time, right, Wes, over at the legislature on different topics and items. But at the end of the day, we know we can sit down and have a dialogue and respectfully disagree. and move separate directions and continue to make the progress forward. And that was truly about finding the collaborative spirit here. We don't always get to an answer on everything, but it definitely helps take down the number of items that we're fighting about. And be able to figure out what that potential pathway forward is. And that's where we spend a lot of our time, is finding where those pathways are and moving forward as quickly as we can once we do.
Danny, I want to bring you in on the regulatory conversation as well, because this is going to be equally important for renewables as it has been for oil and gas and other parts of the energy sector.
Yeah, I mean, regulatory regimes definitely drive outcomes without a doubt. And we see it, it's challenging to have the stability for long-term investment. I mean, renewables is also a deeply capital intensive effort, and paybacks are over useful lives of 30 and 40 years. So that same need for stability of the business environment is necessary. On the other side, we also, and this is probably a little bit challenging if we're going to have the positive intent of even folks in the legislature, is that sometimes we have regulatory structures that are so antiquated that they can't address the problems of today. They can't address the problems that we have. And so it's really challenging from a regulatory perspective to say, to not break the mold, but yet say we still need to make the change. And we see that on a regulatory perspective. We see that on a state perspective. I know that the solar wars, as you refer to them, is kind of an example that has actually promulgated throughout other states and in other jurisdictions. A lot of other utility commissions have followed a very similar suit about sort of getting stakeholders through. And so what you went through, probably more painfully than most, the rest of the country is following through on a lot of leadership. So for us, the regulatory structure will be important about siting, and it still is managed often at state, county, or sometimes just local jurisdiction. And often for us, we're the first time, less so now, but it's the first time we've shown up, and we're setting regulatory regimes for the first time in the community. And it's important in that build of long-term social license for us to make sure that we're doing so in a responsible manner.
So I want to start to think about how we're going to wrap this up. And one thing I think it would be helpful for everyone on the panel to think through is one misconception about the U.S. energy sector, and what's one new fact that you'd like our audience, both present and virtually, that our audience should walk away with today. I think all of you bring a different expertise to this panel, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll actually start. So, I thought it was particularly interesting. The International Energy Agency recently came out with a Pathway to Net Zero report, which listed the things that the world would have to do to get to net zero by 2050. And what I thought was particularly interesting is that one of the base points of that report was that by 2040, the world would be using 7% less energy than the world is using today, which I thought was a particularly interesting assumption, given the world is going to increase by 2 billion people by 2050, and that we expect energy demand is actually going to go up 50%. So, and that's one of the challenges that everyone here on this panel is going to have to deal with in terms of consumer demand. More people and probably more energy demand. So if you could give us one misconception about the U.S. energy sector, and what's one new fact you'd like the audience to walk away with today? And let's start with Danny.
On the misconception side, I think maybe for, particularly being here with this audience, I think a misconception is really sort of how hard and but maybe potentially how easy it is to integrate the first incremental renewables really is. The system is relatively big and relatively flexible on the gas side. And so particularly on the solar side, your first gigawatt of solar, if spread out and responsibly sited, really doesn't really mess with the system. But it becomes increasingly more challenging as you get to around, and you know better than I do, but I'd say about 15% of total energy starts coming from something like solar, a little bit higher on the wind side just due to the sort of nature of it. And so while the intermittency is a challenge, and there's no doubt that you've gone to having to go from 1 hour to a more complicated and dynamic problem of 8,760 hours, many of our electric systems can really absorb what is currently today, and actually with the lowest, the gas prices that you've seen on natural gas side, the cheapest form of additional incremental energy in the system. And so for me, I guess it's variability at the end and towards the second half of that transition, very hard. The beginning of the transition, actually relatively easy. And now that we are at sort of an element that we are competing and really just sort of finding those places where we can replace gas generation, it is the lowest cost form of energy. So that's the misconception. And maybe the new fact is that for me, that last little bit, and maybe it's not new, that last little bit is going to be the biggest challenge. The last mile is the most expensive mile, and that's the same thing on the energy transition. So, what I hope is that as we go down that road, you don't have to have the full plan to 2050 to start moving towards that plan today. And that's what we love to see from leadership, both at corporate level, at the investor level, at the municipal level, at the state level, and at the individual level. You don't have to have the perfect plan on how you get there. You need to start moving in that direction, and we're really happy to see both the breadth and the depth that we're seeing in terms of people adding that third pillar to what's important in energy.
Danny, thank you. Hodge.
One of the misconceptions, I think there are some that believe we can and we should make an immediate switch to renewables. There are. To address the International Energy Agency's Paris-aligned scenario. In that scenario, the energy that's generated by the oil and gas industry will account for about 50% of the energy the world demands in 2040. So the world, billions of people, rely on the energy generated by oil and natural gas today. And through that study, they are going to for decades. One of the things we need to look at is, and what we think about is, we need cleaner energy. And by focusing on the energy that billions of people use today, finding a way to do that in a cleaner fashion, we think there's tremendous opportunity. So one of the facts, taking that another step forward, Chevron's dedicated $3 billion by 2028 to really work on its energy transition strategy. And that's through lowering emissions, utilization of renewables, and offsets where they make sense to our business, and investing in lower greenhouse gas intensity technologies. So our business is really focused on the higher returns and the lower carbon, and really helping with this global energy transition.
I'm going to save the last word for our host. So, Alice.
So I think the general misconception, maybe not so much in this room, but out generally in the public, is that 100% renewables is possible today. What I will tell you is individual homes, cabins in the mountains that have no microwaves or air conditioning, absolutely knock yourselves out. Put your solar panels and your batteries in, you're good to go. But when it comes to the grand system as a total, when people say that they're 100% renewable today, it's not that every kilowatt hour that they're receiving is produced from a renewable resource simultaneously with them using that energy. Usually what it's mean is either they're transferring hours, so the wind is being produced at night, they're consuming coal or natural gas or other items during the day, and then they overproduce those at night and they take the renewable energy credits and put it on top of what they consume during the day and they say, pot's right. So the quality of where we're going with the energy transition matters. when people are investing in the system, and you can go and you can look at, there are papers from Google, who has been one of the foremost authorities on figuring out how do they buy and transition their system to purchasing more and more from renewables. They are publishing papers on exactly what I'm talking about here. So businesses are starting to wisen up, and they're starting to realize the quality of what it is that they're consuming really matters. Second thing is this first ones to the table win. The first communities, the first businesses, the first entities that are looking at, okay, how are we going to do this energy transition? They're then backed up by the rest of the entities that are not making the transition whenever they need it in those off-peak hours when their variable energy resources are not there. That is not what we are doing on the Xcel Energy system in the state of Colorado. We are figuring out how to make all of these things play nice. And I love the way that you put it, because the complexities of our system is at 7,000 megawatts, you might say, wow, that's huge when you think about your individual businesses. It is incredibly small when you look at the intensity and what is used across the country. In ERCOT alone, which is inside of the boundaries of the state of Texas, 76,000 megawatts, okay? My system is tiny as compared to the rest of it, but we have the highest level and integration of renewables on the system in the state of Colorado. My gentlemen and ladies that are running the dispatch system over on the 10th floor of 1800 Larimer, they are more constructive, creative, and have figured out ways to make this work than any other system in the country. They call us to figure out how to make it done and what they can do to close the gap. And that's because we have made the investment in technology. So the piece of the puzzle that I'm going to leave with you is sort of to the tail end of what you were just saying. That last 5 to 7% closing the gap on the energy transition is absolutely going to be the hardest. We cannot afford to pick and choose the winner today. We have to make sure that we have enabling statutes, enabling regulations, investment in R&D, and different areas to figure out what those technologies are going to be able to fill the gap. Because while in Colorado we're sitting here and we have a great plan, if you were to go over and talk to the state regulators or legislators or utilities in Georgia, they don't have the same opportunities that we do here. So they're going to need different technologies than the ones that we have here in order to close the gap. We have to be making investments in these technologies to figure out what that transition is going to look like. The other piece of the puzzle that hasn't been mentioned, and then I'll shut up, is the customer side of this. It's not just about us meeting the customer on ad hoc any amount of energy they want to be able to consume. It's also about our customers being more aware of when they use energy, when they have the opportunity to use low carbon energy versus high carbon energy, low cost energy versus high cost energy, which means we have to get much more of a symbiotic relationship going, because I don't know about how many of you walked the wall this morning and said, God, I hope this works today when you flick that light on. Our customers don't think about what it is that we're providing because we've done such a good job of providing it until it's gone, or it's too expensive, or something else has interrupted it. So this technological innovation isn't just going to be on our side of the aisle, it also has to be on our customer side of the aisle, and educating them and bringing them to the table so that they know and they can lower the cost overall of achieving the targets that we have set as a nation, as a country, as companies, and as individuals.
Thank you. Ron.
Oh gosh, what to say after that? So one more misperception, I think that, and it maybe carries on a little with what Hodge was saying. I think there is a misperception that the conversation that's happening amongst the 1 billion people who live in the type of world we live in today, North America and Europe for the most part, that the solutions, the conversation we are having here is readily applicable to the rest of the world. And I think that's a huge misperception. My sister lives in Nicaragua today. When she turns on right now, when she turns on the switch, it's not a given that the lights will come on there. They live in a very, very different world than we do. And of course, they are having a very, very different conversation than we can enjoy here on this panel today. And so I think there's a misperception that plays into the long-term conversation around what role oil and gas plays that is based around this idea that what we figure out here, we can apply to the other 6.5 billion people who live in the world tomorrow. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. They have a long ways to go on that journey yet. And so I hope that becomes a part of the bigger conversation that we have here. I applaud all that we are doing, and I'm excited that we are at the forefront of these things. But that conversation cannot be had without consideration for the remainder of the world and the journey that they are still on to find themselves in the enjoyable situation that we find ourselves in. One fact I would share. I haven't had a chance to do the math on this. I was listening to a NYSC conversation this morning on ESG, and it was 3 utility providers that were there together. And it was the representative from the provider in Oregon, the utility provider in Oregon. And she quoted a stat that had me scratching my head a little bit. They have 20 BCF of gas storage there. That is their storage mechanism for being able to provide gas through the winter months. And obviously, what is a cold environment that requires a lot of heat? She said our 20 BCF of gas storage, we would have to replace with a $2 trillion battery. I thought that was a very, very interesting economic statistic. I don't know, I haven't done the math on that. I don't know the give and take on that, but 20 BCF of gas storage, $2 trillion battery. So thought that was an interesting stat.
I want to thank all of our panelists. I think just listening to the 4 of you, the future is bright here in the state of Colorado. I've learned so much today, so thank you all very much. I also want to thank Liberty again for hosting us for this great event. And I also want to thank the Colorado Business Roundtable. And Debbie, you've been such a great partner for so many years. Thank you again for hosting this great event today. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Debbie.
All right, thanks, Mike. I just have a couple of short remarks before we wrap up. Wanted to welcome Representative Colin Larson, who came in today. Talking about regulatory issues, I thought I'd want to make you available. And thanks again to the panel. Three things that really stood out for me. One is a celebration of innovation for our state that you all provide. I wish I would have known you when I was taking science classes back in the day, because that would have been helpful for my grades. The second is collaboration. Working together, conversations like this, we're not all clones of each other on how we think about energy, but understanding that we're all needed to be part of the conversation and collaboration moving forward. And then third, just really grateful for their leadership in our state. As I'm sure, I'm so impressed every time I hear these leaders speak, and I'm sure you are all as well. We're fortunate that Colorado is a leader because of the tremendous brain power that we have here. So just grateful for you all for being here today and helping us to learn a little bit more about what you're going through and also how we can be involved in finding those solutions with you. So with that, I also want to thank Liberty for hosting today. We're going to enjoy a reception that they have provided for us out in the lobby. You're welcome to stay and meet some of the panelists today. I believe there's wine on tap, there's beer, and some refreshments for us to enjoy. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and we'll see you right outside. Thanks, everybody.